Welcome to OntarioCyrptids. Today's episode comes directly from the BFRO site, so sit back and relax. Quetico Provincial Park is a large wilderness park in northwestern Ontario, Canada, known for its excellent canoeing and fishing. The 4,760 square kilometer park shares its southern border with Minnesota's Boundary Water Canoe Area Wilderness, which is part of the larger Superior National Forest. These large wilderness parks are often collectively referred to as the Boundary Waters or the Quetico Superior Country. This first encounter comes from a location near the southern end of the park. Inlet Bay is described as having many surrounding lakes, dense woods, swampy beaches with dense wilderness forests stretching for hundreds of miles. Now let's get to the story. This first encounter takes place in the summer of July 13th, 2009. I have been a Boy Scouts of America Scoutmaster for 10 years, and one of my favorite things to do on our campouts around the campfire at night is to read Bigfoot sighting reports to the boys from the BFRO website. Nothing makes them more quiet and compliant once going to bed than thinking that the big guy could be lurking around in the dark just beyond a campfire in the woods. The fact that I can make a very convincing bear growl adds to the fun as well. I have done this around the campfire for years and it has always been great fun. Plus, many of the well-documented sightings make for great entertainment and it beats the heck out of telling ghost stories around the fire. I always secretly hoped I would have my own encounter someday, and just a couple of weeks ago, I finally did. From July 10th to July 18th, 2009, I took my boys on a camping canoeing trip to the Quetico Provincial Park Wilderness Area in Ontario, Canada, just north of Elie, Minnesota. Quetico Park is a limited access wilderness area that requires permits that must be applied for months in advance. It is a huge park about the size of Connecticut with 500 to 600 lakes and pristine woodlands and islands. There are no roads and no motorized boats are allowed anywhere in the park, except for some native Indian guides with grandfathered access rights. It is a perfect place to go for a wonderful wilderness canoeing and camping experience. We checked in at the ranger station at Prairie Portage the afternoon of Saturday, July 11th, and then struck out for a sandy beach camping area in a secluded cove on the northeastern corner of Inlet Bay. This was a camping area on a sandy beach with thick, brushy wilderness extending back into the woods opposite the water for miles. The first night we were there was uneventful, but the second night was pretty interesting. Most of the boys and two of the adult leaders had already gone to bed, but a few of us decided to hang around the fire and just enjoy the evening. Joining me around the fire was another adult leader named Dave, 4 Eagle Scouts, including 2 of my sons and my nephew, and a 13-year-old scout. It had gotten dark and we were just shooting the breeze when my oldest son, Andy, suddenly shushed us all and said, "Do you guys hear that?" We all shut up and listened really close, and what we heard startled us all. I have been wilderness camping for all of my 46 years, and what I heard next was unlike anything I had ever heard before. Most animals will steer clear of fires and people, but whatever this was seemingly pacing back and forth in the woods just beyond our flashlight range. We heard very heavy bipedal footsteps walking through the dense bush just beyond our campsite, crushing twigs and making a lot of noise. Knowing everyone else was already in bed, and considering the absolute darkness, the thick bush, and the fact that no one in their right minds would even be trying to walk around back there at night, we all were a little unnerved, to say the least. Earlier that day, I had gone back into the woods to take care of nature's business, hoping the mosquitoes would leave my lily white rear alone long enough to get the job done without getting too bitten. When I was back there, though, I could not shake the feeling of being watched. Later on, as we discussed our encounters, my nephew said he had felt the same eerie feeling when he had done the same earlier the same day. Anyways, as we stood around the fire, listening to the heavy bipedal pacing back and forth, the boys all decided that this was their cue to get to bed in their tents, as if that would actually provide any protection from whatever this was. As they went to their tents, I stood there listening to the steps, and I could hear deep, heavy breaths, sort of like the archai in the front of the elms deep in the Lord of the Rings, the Two Tower movie. There was no rock throwing or tree knocking, no apparent intimidation behaviors. It just seemed to be something satisfying its curiosity about who we were. When I heard the breathing, I decided that maybe it was time for me to go to bed too, especially since some of the boys were getting spooked and I needed to set a good example of courage. So I laughed about it and told them to get to bed before Bigfoot gets them. As I lay there in my tent, the footsteps began to fade away, and whatever it was left us alone. My son Andy, ever the smart aleck, asked me to tell some more Bigfoot stories, but I said no. I think we were all sufficiently weirded out for now. Andy asked Robert, the 13-year-old, who was also out there with us, if he was freaked out, and he sheepishly answered, sorta. After a few minutes, we heard some wolves howling in the distance, and then we heard a closer, deep howl that sounded like the Ohio Bigfoot howl, but without the dogs barking. When that howl was heard, the wolves abruptly shut up. I told the boys, that's the big guy himself, you guys, and the howl was repeated, though it sounded further away the second time. A moment or so later, I could faintly hear another howl barely audible through the woods. Then there was nothing but absolute silence in the woods. It took a while, but we all finally drifted off to sleep. The next day, I tried to find tracks, but since the area was very overgrown and the ground was thickly covered with leaves, fall, and moss, no definable tracks were seen. I will say this, we were in a very remote region, and the areas that the sounds were coming from that night was difficult to move through in the daylight, much less in the pitch black of the night. None of our people were out of their tents, and none of them would dare to go back into those woods without a flashlight and a buddy or two. We were in an area that has bears, cougars, moose, and many other animals that scouts would not wish to run into unprepared. What we heard was no moose, bear, or cougar. The sounds were heavy, bipedal footsteps just beyond flashlight range, and whatever it was, wasn't frightened by us or our campfire. The breathing was deep and heavy and sounded like it was coming from a very big animal curious about who we were and what we were doing in the woods. I wish I could say that I had the nerve that night to take a flashlight and venture back into those woods to see exactly what it was, especially since I'm a longtime Bigfoot enthusiast, but honestly, I was too unnerved to try it, and no one would have come with me, especially after the breathing sounds I heard. I am not sure anyone else heard those sounds because I went to bed last. Once I heard that sound, though, I knew it was time for me to back down and pack it in. I realized that without an actual sighting, my encounter is best a Class B, but I'm convinced that Sasquatch paid us a visit that night. Well, that was a great story. I don't know if I would have grabbed a flashlight either and headed for the woods, especially in the dark and not knowing what is actually out there. For all you know, you could be encountering a bear, cougar, like he stated, or even worse than that, a Sasquatch. But anyways, why don't we move along to the second story? Algonquin Park is located in southern Ontario, Canada. Its forests, rivers, and numerous lakes, including the large lake of Two Rivers, are home to moose, bear, and common loons. The park's many trails include the Whiskey Rapid Trail, the Ox Tongue River, and the Barren Canyon Trail with views from the northern rim. Algonquin Park is roughly 7,653 square kilometers. For comparison purposes, this is larger than the state of Delaware, or about 1.5 times the size of Prince Edward Island, or about a quarter of the size of Belgium. This next encounter takes place near Rain Lake Access Road at Western Upland Backpacking Trail at the southern end of Algonquin Park. July 13th, summer of 2009. We arrived at our campsite probably between 5 and 6 p.m. We set up the tent, made a campfire, and had dinner. After, we sat down watching the fire. About an hour later, we decided to pack up and head to bed. My son crawled into bed around 9:15. I tidied up a few things in camp just in case it rained, made sure the fire was out, and then went to bed. I was lying in my tent about to fall asleep when the forest went dead quiet. It was an uneasy feeling. Then I felt an enormous thud on the ground. The thud was totally silent and it did not disturb my sleeping son. I thought the thud was my heart giving out, as it was followed by arrhythmia, and I was praying that this was not the time or the place for me to have a heart attack. I thought I smelt a skunk smell, but when I breathed in deeper a second breath, I smelt nothing. The forest remained calm, and I listened intently, thinking we were visited by a bear. The next morning, my son and I did some testing, as it is possible to feel vibrations from walking on the thin soil overlaying the shield rock, which sounds like hollow ground when walking upon it. We determined that whatever it was had to have been within 4 feet of the tent. We could not reproduce the altitude of the thud. We did discover where the animal came down from the trail into the campsite, and determined that neither of us had walked that way that night. We also believe that a 400-pound bear would not have produced a thud unless it jumped. I thought that it felt more like a 1,000-pound moose, but I could not explain why a moose would come down that close to a designated campsite. I also thought I heard a loon hooting later that night, but the hoot did not sound right, as it was more like a whoop than a hoot and much louder. When we arrived in camp, there was a tree about 8 inches in diameter that had been snapped off about 2 feet above the ground. The splinters were fresh on the ground, not covered by other forest debris such as pine needles, as nearby ground conditions exhibited. The tree had been snapped off. I noticed this as I cut the splinted end off the stump for firewood the next morning. It had not been chopped down or cut down, it was just the stump. I didn't think anything of it at the time, a dead tree blown down in the woods. But in retrospect, it was fresh, no debris on the stump as well, which begs the question, where was the fallen tree? Surely someone could not have burnt it all up in a day. There was not enough fresh ash in the fire pit when we arrived. Also, who cuts up a fallen down tree and hauls the whole thing off for firewood? I'm not even sure that the tree was in that condition when I first surveyed the site, after having went forward to survey the second site and returned to the first. I didn't notice it until after my son and I were both off-site for some time hanging up the bear bag. I have been in bear country before. I had to chase one off. At the time, my son was 7, and I took my daughter 16-month-old into Gatineau last week, but I can honestly say that this was the most scared I have ever been. If it was a Sasquatch or whatever they are called, I think I know why they were unhappy with our presence. I tested a bear banger flare at the bridge just to make sure that they were in working order. The wind caught the flare and blew it into a tree. Stupid me. It was embarrassing, having to tell my son to wait on the trail while I investigated to make sure my idiot moment didn't catch the forest on fire. How careless of me. Anybody having observed this stunt would have judged me for a rookie and wouldn't want me camping near them. Well, I am when it comes to backpacking. I have done wilderness canoe camping in Quetico Provincial Park a dozen times before. The place was littered with moose and bear signs, with many bear footprints that seemed large and elongated, more so than what I'm used to seeing. Everything was not adding up, and we decided to hike out, giving up the last 7 days of our adventure. While walking out, I had the feeling of being watched, and even noticed something large in the bushes about 40 meters away. Upon investigation and finding nothing, I just assumed it was overactive imagination. But the more I think, the more things add up. Wow, that's another great story. Now, just so you know, both of these stories came from the BFRO website. And both of these stories occurred on July 13th, 2009. What are the odds? So I was curious to see whether or not that date happened to be a full moon. And as it turned out, it was not a full moon on that day. Anyways, you can't win them all. I hope you enjoyed these 2 encounter stories. In the future, I hope to be telling your story on my channel and not reading them off of a BFRO website. Well, that's a wrap for today's encounter stories. If you would like to share your encounter story in a safe environment, please forward your stories to OntarioCyrptids@gmail.com. By the way, your stories does not have to originate from Ontario, and they can be as anonymous as you would like. Oh, and before I forget, please hit that like button and lend some support by subscribing to my channel. Bye for now, and see you all next time when I share my encounter story.